Welcome to Beyond the B, an ongoing dialogue about the past, present, and future of the B Corp movement. Co-hosts Emmy Allison and Ryan Honeyman facilitate an open and honest conversation about the B Corp movement, advise companies on how to increase their impact, and provide a deep dive into the new B Corp standards that are shaping our community.
I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner and worker-owner at Lyft Economy. I have two guests today. So first, partner and chief impact officer at Junction, Adam Garfunkel has spent the last 35 years calling for companies to do more for people and the planet. Adam has changed laws as an environmental campaigner, pioneered sustainability reporting, and launched global sustainable finance initiatives. He now leads the consulting delivery team at Junction and likes to say he serves Junction's clients as a critical friend, which we may get into in this podcast. Adam is a B leader and a member of B Lab UK's Regional Standards Advisory Group, as well as being an advisor to the Sustainable Beauty Coalition and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Adam, welcome to the show.
Hey, great to be here, Ryan.
And second, we have Mike Rowlands. So Mike is an accomplished entrepreneur and changemaker and a thoughtful advisor to the audacious leaders who are building the success stories of the purpose economy. He's a partner and CEO at Junction Strategy, a firm that for over 20 years has been advising on strategy, sustainability, and social impact for some of the world's most courageous and generative companies, nonprofits, and movements. Mike has also co-founded the Canadian Purpose Economy Project, which aims to accelerate the take-up of social purpose in business. He sits on the board of directors of Hollyhock, a lifelong leadership learning center on Canada's West Coast, where he's an executive producer of the renowned annual Social Venture Institute. And he served for 5 years as an entrepreneur in residence at SFU's Radius Ventures, and he's been an ambassador for B Corps for over a decade. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here. Great to be among B nerds, isn't it?
Yeah, the B nerds unite right here. Well, Adam, maybe I'll jump in with you. So how did you, if you could give folks a little bit about your background and sort of tell us how you got into the work you're doing today.
Sure. I like to say this story starts with meeting a woman in a bar in Bruges in Belgium. And I chased her all around the world. I even dropped out of university to do it and ended up living with her in her native Vancouver, BC. And someone said Greenpeace was hiring door-to-door canvassers. And I thought, sounds like a good job. You got to keep about 35-40% of what you raised. So I thought, well, Canadians, they've got to be suckers for an English accent, right? So I thought I'd give it a go. I was totally sucked. I was awful. But then I got good. And along the way, I just realized there was so much to do. And I felt like I found my calling. So I came back to the UK. It was the early 90s recession. I worked in bars and restaurants by night and volunteered at Friends of the Earth by day until I got a campaigner job there. And I led the organization's work on what became the 1995 UK Environment Act. And all the work we did was about people having a right to know about the impacts business is having on their lives. So I took that mindset into consulting, ethical communications and strategy in the mid to late 90s and been doing that ever since. Took over Junction UK in 2013 without ever meeting Mike in person, it so happens. And we were becoming a B Corp when B Lab was getting ready to launch in the UK in 2015. We were sort of on that track already. And I saw an opportunity for us to develop a bit of a profile for our sustainability strategy services through advocating for B Corp. So we were really the first to market that as a service in the UK. And I think we've played a pretty big role in developing the movement in the UK. And that Canadian woman that I mentioned, we've been married for nearly 30 years and live together mostly happily here in London now.
Beautiful. And were you in Vancouver when you met Mike and started Junction, or did that start after you had already?
Yeah, I was back here. We were
back there. Okay.
We were connected by a mutual friend. In fact, a Canadian guy I did my master's with in 2000. I blagged my way onto a master's course without ever completing a bachelor's degree through my work experience. So,
love it. Very cool. And Mike, how about you? How did you get to this place you are today?
Yeah, it's pretty cool reflecting on that, Adam. I think Adam and I were business partners for the closer part of a year before we actually met, which was pretty amazing. How did I get here? I think, it starts with me taking a wrong turn when I exited university. I thought I was going left and I was going to join the Foreign Service, was pretty sure that's where my career was headed. But instead, I followed a mentor into his advertising business. So started in this advertising agency. Over the next few years, we built an interactive agency 5 years before anybody used the phrase interactive agency. We won a bunch of awards for early websites. We helped lots of companies embrace the internet for the first time, for marketing, for retail, for national, international, very international expansion. And then in early '02, I started a new firm that was focused on values-based branding. And that was a new concept at the time, building a brand not based on a technology or a product or a service or even a market opportunity, but instead building a brand based on the values that brought a leadership team together and what cohered an executive group. And we did really well on that. It was sort of post-dot-com bust, so everybody was looking for something a bit more authentic, a little richer, a little deeper, and we had this fantastic methodology. So we grew the firm really well. And a few years later, I decided to focus it on social enterprise. So over the course of about 3 years, between 2007 and 2010, we shifted the entire portfolio of clients towards nonprofits and social venture. And then we merged in 2011 with our crosstown rival, which was Junction. And I've been CEOing here ever since. So add it all up, you've got about 20 plus years of business advisory services, throw in a few years as an entrepreneur in residence, a few years on the board of Social Venture Network, 11 years now on the board at Hollyhock, which you mentioned off the front, and about 10 years co-convening the Social Venture Institute. So today, on reflection, that sort of wrong turn coming out of university turned out to be a pretty good move after all. And for what it's worth, I studied philosophy in university and still study it today. So one of the great questions that philosophers have always asked through time is, what does it mean to live the good life? And I think my career in retrospect has essentially been an exploration of that question.
Going deep. I love it. It's like going deep right at the beginning.
Yeah, not scared of that for sure.
Well, just so the listeners have a sense of the framing. So Mike and Adam and I have talked for a while about, some of these bigger issues in the B Corp movement, some of the things around the new standards, systems change, and how whether the new standards are effective in driving systems change, how the B Corp movement can drive systems change. We've talked about like the levers for that. We've talked about the purpose economy work that Mike's been doing and multinationals. So we may go to a lot of different places in the interview today, but we think a lot of this is really interesting to folks, and we hope it's interesting. And one other thing is some of the European and UK perspective, especially with the new regulations coming into play and what that means for B Corps and whether the B Corp standards are going to meet those regulations, et cetera. So maybe, Adam, just starting with you, we've talked about the new B Corp standards and sort of their relationship to systems change and not just like being a better business individually. Could you say more about why it's important, or do you see the new standards as being better situated to create systems change than the current version?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ryan. I think the answer is definitely yes. I'm sure those of us who work in this movement know only too well that the previous or the current or old, whichever version, if you want to call them, of the B Corp standard is a kind of pick your own path to 80 points model. And minimum requirements across a basket of 7 impact topics and some eligibility questions is a total game changer, right? It's normative. It says, this is what the world needs. No less will do. So that's already just a very different framing for the new standards compared to the old ones. And as your question hints, the old standards were really about how an individual business could be best for the world, to use that B Corp phrase. And I think the new standards are much more about what a company can do to play its part in system change. When I talk about this, I like to do a little bit of history. And I think it's important to say that, like, with the best of intentions, the old standards version 6 were great, but to be a little unkind, you could say they were already out of date when they landed. And why do I say that? Because let's look at what they landed into in January 2019 when they were launched. 3 months earlier, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released what became known as the SR15 report, the special report on 1.5 degrees, and said we need rapid and far-reaching changes to the way society is organized. We had David Attenborough saying, if we don't take action, the collapse of our civilization, the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon. We had Greta Thunberg starting her school strikes for climate, and from a couple of months before the B Corp standards came out, you had thousands of kids in hundreds of cities around the world not going to school on Friday, holding signs. I mean, my kids did this, maybe others did, with signs saying system change, not climate change. So January, B Corp V6 comes out, apparently the leading framework for like holistic sustainability measurement and management. And it's asking you, do you measure your scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions? And if you do, put the number of tons in this box, please. Like, that's, look through that lens. It wasn't really delivering what was being asked for at the cutting edge. And I think V7 or B Corp 2.0, I think is a better labeling for it, is much closer to what the world is asking for today. So let's to dive into that a little bit more. As I say, what are the numbers of your scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions in tons is the old standards. The new standards is tell us about your climate transition plan. That's a very different nature of question. Or human rights, really very loosely touched on in the old or current standards at all. A little bit about how you're managing your supply chain. New ones got a whole impact topic on human rights. Companies have to explore what are the negative or potential negative human rights impacts that are happening across your whole value chain. Essentially, how does your business model negatively affect people? Or if you're a finance business, how do your portfolio companies negatively affect people in where they operate, how they operate, who they source from, how they source, where they process what they do, and so on. So again, a very different nature of question. And I think that's much more likely to drive system change because it's taking the company beyond its own gates, right? It's saying, look at your suppliers, look at your customers, look across that whole value chain and do a really rigorous double materiality assessment, to use the jargon, and assess, the negative risks to your business from people and planet, but also your impacts on people and planet, and build a plan of action from there. That's a very different type of framing than V6. So I think in that sense, it promises a lot. Let's hope it delivers.
Yeah. Mike, would you add anything to that? What's your take?
One of the key points, of course, is that it was possible to navigate version 6 and prior with a small group of thoughtful leaders inside an enterprise, but it didn't necessarily shift the trajectory of the enterprise. So it could be, and I think in truth it often was, a nice badge and a bit of work. But for a lot of the companies that made it into the community, it didn't actually shift the trajectory of the enterprise. And I think that's actually what we're trying to do. We're trying to change the trajectory of enterprises, broadly speaking. And we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to affect a system and what system we're trying to affect. But if I can achieve a certification without really changing the habits and practices of the enterprise, then we're not making the progress that B Lab set out to achieve. And so in that way, it had fallen behind. It was time to make a pretty dramatic shift. And I think, you can argue about history and decisions that could have been made. Should we have been more ambitious in 2019? Should we have pushed through to what now, I agree with Adam, this feels more like version 2.0 because it's such a dramatic change going to version 7. Should we have pushed harder for that in 2018, 2019, 2020? Yeah, probably. But knowing then what we know now is a little bit of a cheat. Pretending that we knew then what we know now is a bit of a cheat. I think we've caught up. I think version 7 is going to take us a lot further to shifting the trajectory of businesses.
Mike, you did have a good point about what does it mean to affect systems and which systems are we trying to affect? Could you speak a little bit more about that as it relates to the B Corp?
Yeah, I mean, you go right back to founding and the reason that B Lab was started in the first place. The idea was to advocate for change and make business a force for good in the world. Okay, so what does that mean? Is it about an individual business being a force for good? Well, an individual business can be thought of as a system. And if the certification encourages that little system to change, then that business becomes a force for good. Great. And I've just said lots of companies certified without making that change to business, but a lot of companies were enlightened by that process and did make significant changes in their enterprises and did increase their score over time, an indicator that they were changing the trajectory of the business. But I don't think that in itself is why B Lab started. B Lab started because it was a response to unfettered extractive capitalism. And it's exactly that system that we want to change. So what does it mean for us to develop a network of businesses that together, collectively, shift the norms of capitalism to put fetters around, limits around the scope of what businesses are allowed to do, to encourage businesses to make positive contributions rather than merely managing down the negative side effects of business as usual, and to shift from extractive to generative capitalism. Right? These are big questions. We joked off the front about going deep with philosophy. Well, these are big, deep questions of what it means of how do we structure society? How do we think about the role of business in society? How does that relate to civil society and the public sector and government regulation and legislation? That's the system that we're trying to change. And I think B Lab still has a very big role to play in influencing that change-making process.
Adam, one critique that folks like Dr. Bronner's had is that, B Corp isn't doing enough really. And maybe that was a lot of drawn on version 6, but I think, they had a sense of what was coming a little bit with this next version. So in this transition of systems change, one could argue, well, the way that B Lab is going about it is directionally good, but say just letting companies that maybe are not as high impact as some feel they should be into the community, is that really systems change, or is that like the lipstick on a pig type argument? It's like, oh, we're just making these companies look better. So what would you say to like the systems change, argument, I think a lot of folks can get behind, but it's like, what's the timeline for the change? Because I think some people like Bronner's are like, we want this like next year, like we need to be all hands on deck, forcing every company to do this. And some, maybe it's like Nespresso is more like, maybe it's 50 or 100 years before they can really make that systems change transition. What's your take on that?
Well, on timings, I'm more of a Dr. Bronner's fan than I am an Nespresso fan. I don't think we have 50 to 100 years to make that transition anything like. I don't expect the economy to operate in the 2040s the way it operates today. I can't see that. So I think one of the ways we'd like to use B Corp at Junction is to say, look, here's a third-party framework. It's got some great ideas embedded in it, better than ever in B Corp 2.0. Questions you need to be asking yourself are, how do we endure as a business in a business climate, but a natural climate that is worsening very quickly, and that's going to have, which is inevitably going to have adverse impacts on our ability to source raw materials or to get our products to customers where we want them to get them to, and so on. How do we endure? We need to ask ourselves questions about how we're going to be here in 10, 15 years' time. And you might as well use a third-party framework as a bit of a tool to help you ask yourself some of those questions. I don't think anyone should be looking at the tool and going, that's too hard, we'll come back to that in 50 years' time. They should be looking at the tool going, that might be too hard today. Let's do some of it. Let's try. Like, we can't do all of it. We can't meet all 7 minimum requirements. Okay, but let's meet 6 or 2, or let's start. Companies have to go on a journey, and I don't think there's any time to waste. They have to change that. A lot of companies have to change their fundamental business models, and within 5 to 10 years, I would say, not with the 50 to 100.
And I think, Adam, we spoke about previously the 2 topics within the 7. So like the human rights and government affairs and collective action. Do you see those as being particularly useful levers in like a systems change framework?
I do. I think it's interesting. Human rights is here, and it's rightly here. It's pretty new. I mean, in the run of business attention to social and environmental topics, it's pretty new, right? I was doing some reminding. The UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights were only endorsed in 2011. That's not even 15 years ago. Business, when John Ruggie kind of started doing that work with the UN, he was asking companies, how do you know that you respect human rights? Do you have any kind of process that gives you confidence that your business model is respecting human rights? And like, the answer was no. Essentially, like 15 years ago, there was not really much, any business really, that could give a really strong answer to that. I want to doff my hat to an old client of mine, Adidas, who back in 2000 started exploring this issue really deeply in terms of public reporting, and even before that with codes of conduct. And I would say by 2010, they had a pretty good handle on the challenges in their supply chain, and some of the other leading sporting goods businesses along with them. But for most businesses, human rights due diligence is just like, what is that? That's a new phrase. We don't know anything about that. And it's still true today that most companies are not modifying their behavior in the light of findings that they might uncover through doing a human rights due diligence assessment. So if, let's get real here. When shareholders' interests have primacy, people get hurt and the planet gets polluted. That's it. That's the equation here. So if you are doing that, you are hurting people somewhere. And if you want to run the business in a wise and ethical manner, you should be paying attention to that. I think human rights due diligence could really sift the dial here. So I'm really delighted to see it in the new B Corp standards. And really, I think it's really important that it's front and center and brought into a materiality assessment as it has been through the standards. And on government affairs, this is a really interesting one. Government affairs and collective action. So it's tax and lobbying and collective action are the three main sub-requirements in that impact topic. I think together these three have huge potential to be game changers. I personally think that in much of the world, we have a very unhealthy relationship with tax. I think the Legion of Tax Advisors around the world making a lot of money, minimizing tax takes would suggest that that's the paradigm that we operate in. But if you think about the world's most innovative and fair societies in places like Scandinavia, they're also very high tax regimes, and they just have a more mature relationship. And again, if you're privatizing the profits and socializing the costs, that's another way of describing business as usual. That's how mainstream businesses run. That can't continue. So again, I think that sort of fair tax principle at the heart of that sub-requirement is really, really strong, as is the lobbying thing. I think it's really exciting to see multinationals or larger companies wrestle with the bodies that they're members of and what they're going to do about that. I think that's a great challenge, particularly to the larger ones, like I say. And on collective action, if I'm honest, I don't think the standards go far enough on that one. I think there's a sort of it's one of those ones where there's a basket of topics, and for most businesses, you can choose to do 2 of the 5. So if we want to nerd out a little bit here, you can pay for some research and mentor some people and say you contributed to collective action. Now that's not, frankly, good enough. It's not sufficient, to my mind. I appreciate the very, very largest companies have to do 4, but eventually, and that's a tiny slice at the top of the B Corp movement, I think we should be asking for something quite different and more substantive on advocacy from all B Corps.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Mike, for you, speaking to the systems change element, and actually Adam just touched on something that I think has plagued version 6/old/current standards a lot, which is tick the box. It's like, do you have this policy? Do you have that policy? Do you have this community service? Do you have this local purchasing? How do you find that companies can really embody B Corp values and standards? Like, the new standards, as good as they are, still, I don't think can force companies to embody every aspect of that you can be with a B Corp. And this maybe touches on purpose economy and some of your other work, but how do we sort of nudge companies towards, I want to live this fully across the company, as opposed to, I think you were saying earlier, there's 6 people at the company who even know we're a B Corp and the other 500 have no idea. So I guess my question is, how do we sort of nudge towards embodiment and really living the values across the organization? And do you think these new standards direct us towards that?
Yeah, great question. You're asking that. I'm reflecting on the Dr. Bronner point earlier. I haven't spoken to anybody directly at Dr. Bronner's, but my sense from having seen the conversation as it played out publicly is that their expectations of B Lab were really, really high, really, really high. And as successful as they've been and as profound as the work is, it's not a big organization, really. So are they expecting too much? Are they asking too much of the nonprofit that runs the certification? Are they expecting them to help people sort of embody this sense of what a next economy looks like, what a purpose economy looks like? That's a big ask. That's training, it's professional development, it's all sorts of transformational experiential work. That's not B Lab's role. That's somebody else's role. It's not B Lab's role. What about advocating for policy shifts? B Lab has done tremendous work advocating for the Benefit Corp form in I don't know how many jurisdictions now, many, many jurisdictions. That's amazing. It's an incredible suite of achievements. But are they advocating for tax policy in every country where there are B Corps? Of course not. They don't have that kind of reach and capacity. Imagine, are they shifting human rights legislation to pick up on that theme in all those countries? No, of course not. They don't have that kind of capacity. But what they can do is mobilize the now 10,000 plus certified companies to do those things. And so to your question about how do we nudge and encourage, I think as the new standards embed and we start to allow for the metaphorical conversation between the topic areas, we're going to look at things like requirements for collective action through the lens of the requirement to state a public purpose. And the public purpose is we have to articulate an optimal strategic contribution that we're making to the long-term well-being of all people in the environment. And we can get into where that language comes from. If it's my job as a leader of an organization to optimize for my strategic contribution, and I'm looking at advocacy and legislative affairs, then what's the optimal strategic contribution I can make? This isn't about the bare minimum. It's not about the tick box. It's about the optimal strategic contribution. So when we look at the topics as a whole, I think there are ways and spaces where we can nudge the conversation. We can encourage more action. We can encourage more commitments from members. And with a community of 10,000 companies, that's getting to be a big number. There's a lot of great practices that can be shared among that community. And that's B-Lab's work. That's B-Lab's work.
Do you find, like, I'm even trying to think of Patagonia, there's probably still a lot of employees there who probably don't even know that they're a B Corp, right? So it's like even the sort of apotheosis best companies still have people who are just taking a paycheck. Like, dude, I'm just coming in. I got a lot going on in my life. I can't engage with all this purpose stuff. But you could argue that the density of the people who really care and like have that embodiment is much higher at a company like Patagonia. And so I'm curious for you, Mike, have you seen like practices or like in your consulting work, like what are sort of the habits, behaviors, or practices of companies that you find really like activate their employees more around their purpose or around maybe the B Corp idea versus companies that maybe just check the box?
Yeah, it's a totally delicious question. So I think there's a tendency among many that are interested, that are exploring B Corp certification, to view it as a marketing exercise, right? We're going to get market share. We're going to get customer loyalty because we've got this lovely B in a circle on our packages, our products, our website, et cetera. So a lot of people come into the work with that mindset and perspective. And then as they get into the BIA and start doing the work, they realize this actually touches a lot of other things. And so that in itself is a bit of enlightenment. It's a bit of awakening. It's a bit of an opening to possibility and potential. And then in the companies that we find are really successful, that turns into an internal conversation. So it's not about that small group of a few people that understand the certifications. It's actually about socializing the potential across the whole organization. I was reviewing a paper that a friend is going to publish shortly. I was just reading over the paper yesterday, and his thesis is that there's really, really important work to do to help individual people articulate their own purpose and then help them to see how that aligns to the corporate purpose, because that'll drive more engagement, it'll drive more momentum, get everybody sort of swimming in the same lane. I think that's a really important piece. I think another piece is looking at how leading companies in a sector influence the sector as a whole. And this is part of Junction's theory of change. If we can get leaders in sectors to exhibit more responsible and truly purposeful behavior, then those become the companies that we admire. Case in point, Patagonia. And that shifts the way sectors work. And really, if we shift the way sectors work and think and behave, that's actually what changes the way the economy works and thinks and behaves. And I think the great companies celebrate their successes, talk about their failures, and they do that in public disclosures. Right. So Adam talked about Adidas a minute ago, whom we worked with for many years. And one of the things that they did early on was talk about where they were failing, talk about where they were getting stuck on sustainability factors. And that was exhibited in public sustainability disclosures to all of their peers. And we have another client that has been a network of sporting goods firms that have begun to share practices. And they did that because one or two of them were being transparent and exhibiting where they were falling down and sharing practices across the network. So these things happen. They happen in pockets. But I think the threads for me are you have to engage all of your people, right? You have to mobilize the entire organization. You have to look beyond the walls of the organization and think about how your purpose can, yes, advance the success of your business, but also shift the way your sector thinks. And I think you have to be transparent in public disclosures. And we need to see more and more regulation around what we ought to be disclosing.
Adam, any other practices you would add on to that, like that sort of can trigger that embodiment across the organization?
Well, one of the things that I think is I'm really proud that we do at Junction, and we've encouraged our clients to do this as well. In fact, we posted a kind of how-to in the Fair Work section. It's one of the documents you can go download there. Is about values and stating the principles and behaviors that underpin those values, and then measuring the degree to which leadership and the whole organization adhere to those values or don't. So just to do a little bit of an open sharing with you here, we say that one of our values is courage. And we unpacked what that meant for us. And one of the things that means is speaking truth to power. So in our client engagements, when we're at our best, we say the difficult thing that needs to be said.
Is this the critical friend that we're getting to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so as you suggest, I'm fond of this particular value and leaning into it. And when like I say, when I'm sort of at my best, I guess, and I encourage all of us to do that. And so we did a survey. So once you've got principles, it's not just a word on a wall, right? You can go, okay, there is this. Did leadership speak truth to power? Always, usually, sometimes, a little bit, never, right? And so you can do a 5-point Likert scale question on that. So we got back a questionnaire from the staff about values at Junction, the various principles within our 4 values of fun, curiosity, generosity, and courage. And there's sort of whatever that is, a dozen or so principles within those 4 values. And I was a little bit shocked at the poor score we got on leadership courage. So I was like, oh, got to do something about that. So I suggested that in our internal project kickoff template, so we're pretty nerdy, we love having things to, templates to go to, I insisted that a question that's in there for the project team to ask is, what is the audacious question to ask of this client on this project? So that is now in our kickoff meetings internally for every project that we start, maybe, whatever that is, 60, 80 a year. And it's on the project sponsor, which is often Mike or me, to choose the moment to ask that question in the run of the project. So then we got a better score next year round on our values survey. But I didn't do it because of that, but I did it because the information is helping me be a better leader and exemplify what I want from our team. I want them to ask those questions if they have the opportunity to. And in that way, I think we embed this way of thinking across people in the business.
I really love that example because my business partners, Kevin and Sean, have done something a few times with clients where it's like a large restaurant group and they'll be like, what if you completely redesign? It's sort of like the audacious question. Like, what if you completely redesigned all these things and used like regenerative beef or like, organic and like rethought about and just sort of it's sort of like, here's the audacious what if. And it's really scary as a consultant to do that because you're like, I don't want to piss off the client, with something that they're like, why are you even presenting this? But also, I think there's maybe an assumption, I'll just speak for myself sometimes, that people are like, I'm busy. I just want just get the work done that we agreed on and don't do that much else, But I think that's maybe limiting even in maybe my own thinking as in client engagements. I'm not sure if that resonates with you, Adam.
Yeah, maybe. I don't necessarily think it has to be a whole kind of, we insist on you coming to a workshop so we can do some blue sky scenario thinking with you and as an extra thing. I think it's about how you show up in the natural run of the project. And sometimes we do that better than other times. Recently, we had a client, lovely client, and I just said, I think you're greenwashing on the way you talk about your claims on your website. And everyone's getting much more from that.
That's the critical friend thing as well, right there.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
And
how'd they react to that one?
So interestingly, the owner and the MD were in the room with a couple of the other senior leaders. And the MD was like straight on it, show me where, I want to know. Okay, I'm going to kind of sort this out. And afterwards, privately, in a sort of wrap-up meeting, she said, that was brave of you to do that. I'm really pleased you did that, because it's important that we don't make those mistakes. And that, she said, I used to be a consultant. I'm impressed that you went there. So, okay, there you go. Just want to make peers give me some good feedback. That's nice. But I'm helping them, right? I just threw it into a meeting. It doesn't have to be a whole separate thing. Or...
I think there's two things there that I find really interesting. One is you were able to say that because we put relationships first. Right. This isn't about transactions. This isn't just about, delivering a report. We put relationships first. And because we're in that sort of personal relationship with clients, we're able to say things, we're able to have conversations because there's that degree of trust. And that's not unique in any way, but I think it should be taken really seriously by consultants that want to advance change inside organizations. But the other side of any of those conversations is the audience receptivity to the statement or the question, right? What does that provocation do inside the person who's hearing it, receiving it, listening or not listening? And I'm increasingly interested in our inner lives and our ability to receive that kind of critical feedback. And I think one of the leverage points that's not B Lab's work, but is important work to be done, is helping people sort of develop the inner capacity to confront these kinds of really significant critiques to business as usual, really significant changes and uncertainty about how to navigate the change and the ambiguity of decision making. This is not sort of predictable, straight line kind of work. This is hard. It's ambiguous. It requires a great deal of sort of emotional energy on behalf of decision makers and thinkers at a time when we're being asked to do more and more with less and less, and the pace of business seems to be accelerating. So that kind of mindfulness and presence and inner capacity to receive critical feedback, that may be a scarce resource, but it can't be if we're going to make this transition. I'm going to start a training. You've probably seen them, the inner development goals. I just signed up to start a training starting in October. It runs for about 5 or 6 months. I'm really looking forward to it. These are 23 skills that have been identified to help people lead successfully in organizations and governments, but through all of the ambiguity and dramatic change we're experiencing globally.
This is something that Junction's going to be running in October? Or
No. This is the IDG's inner development goals.
Got it.
Been developed out of a nonprofit, I think out of Sweden, but it's become this global, collaborative, totally open, crowdsourced and open sourced body of knowledge. And I'm just going to get a training on how to be a useful ambassador for that work.
Yeah, beautiful. Adam, I'm wondering if we could talk a little about Europe and I'm not sure how many listeners actually know what's coming down the pipeline in Europe. So maybe could you just explain what's been going on there, a little bit of the backstory, and then how does it impact folks in the B Corp world? Just assuming folks are starting from a very low knowledge base of what's happening.
Sure. I'll do my best to recap sort of 15 years of European legislative history. There are now 27 countries in the EU because, stupidly decided to leave. And there's complicated processes of how they make laws, directives, and so on. And they, for a long time, have been working on a kind of green transition. And there's a number of different aspects to that. There's financial taxonomies that some people might have heard about. There's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, that some people might have heard about. Even the Due Diligence Directive as well. But I actually want to start by talking about the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive, because I think you probably touched on this on a previous pod, but it's perhaps worth just going there first, because this most directly relates to B Corps. So there's been a bunch of regulations that have been coming in. Some of them have been pulled back, and I'll get onto that in a second. But the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive is particularly important for B Corps, because one of the things it says is that a certification scheme can't mark its own homework, essentially. So you have to have third-party conformity assessment bodies, over there, auditors who check that companies have met the B Corp standards. And at the moment, as we know, that B Lab sometimes uses some third parties to do some of the work, but they ultimately have the say on whether a company has met the standards or not. And that's called second-party certification, not third party. It's kind of like halfway house, not good enough. And what this means for B Corps is if you trade in Europe, B2C, really, if you trade to consumers in Europe by September next year, unless you have certified under the new standards, you will be falling foul of that directive. Because the current old P6 standards were not policed in that way. They won't be policed in that way. They won't be audited by third parties in that way. The new standards, the B Corp 2.0, have been designed deliberately with this regulation in mind, and they are in the process, as we understand it, of working out which auditors they're going to, I guess, train and subcontract to do the third party verifying. Which means that if you want to put the B Corp logo on your pack in a year's time, you actually might have to certify twice. We have a well-known drinks company that we've helped certify, and they trade in Europe, and they are going through V6 recertification right now, and they're going to have to go through B Corp 2.0 recertification starting in January. And that's also, I think, of interest to B Corps, because if you're wondering why a lot of companies with a 2026 recert got a year's grace, I'm thinking it's not to help you spend longer transitioning. It's so that we can bring forward all of those B Corps in our stable who must recertify. Otherwise, they will fall foul of European legislation. So our first cohorts have to be the companies that are going to be captured by the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive. So I just wanted to get out there. That's its own, basket of horrors. Like as I've often said in the last few weeks, companies are very happy with certifying every 3 years and paying an annual certification fee to be lab. They weren't thinking of certifying every year when they signed up for this, and there are plenty that are going to have to go on that journey. So that's the thing. But along with that, of course, we have what's called the CSDDD and the CSRD, horrible multi-word acronyms. And there's essentially been a rollback on those. So there was lots of great promise to the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. It does still maintain the concept of double materiality at its heart, but it's going to apply to like 20% of the companies it was originally going to be. They were originally going to be in scope. So it's been massively kind of rolled back, only for companies of 1,000 people and more and 50 million euros in turnover. And on the due diligence directive piece, that's also been, the scope's massively reduced. It was going to be, you have to check on your supply chain every year. Now it's every 5 years and so on. So there's been a real kind of drawback from, ultimately disappointing drawback from what looked like it could be a bit of a game changer with a lot more companies in scope for double materiality. And in theory, smart thinking about what that meant for their business models, in theory, not just reporting. That's
Could you just
different.
quickly define double materiality just for folks?
For sure. So the concept comes from sort of what's financially material, significant would be another word for it. And single materiality is just saying, okay, there's a world out there. It's kind of like a pestle analysis, right? There's a world out there. It's going to have impacts on our business, on our risks, on our things. There's risks we need to think about out in the world. I know if we source from water stressed areas, then maybe water stress is an issue that we need to think about, because maybe our cotton isn't going to be so plentiful from that region in 5 years' time or something. And that's just thinking about what's going to hit us in our pocketbook. Double materiality says, okay, but we also have impacts on people and planet as a business in the way we operate and how we choose to source and so on. So, for example, am I paying a living wage or ensuring that my suppliers treat their workers, in a fair, safe, and healthy manner? If I'm not, then I have a negative impact on people through the way I run my business. And both of those need to be considered in a double materiality assessment, largely because those social and environmental impacts that you have as a business are likely to come back and bite you anyway in time in your pocketbook, right? So they're likely going to have a financial risk to them, reputational risk or what have you, license to operate might be withdrawn and so on. So it's a process that looks at both of those, engages with stakeholders, kind of limits the number of topics to us, ideally a manageable handful, gets highest governing body validation. And in theory, what should happen is they're not just like a list of 6 topics. In theory, the highest governing body should say, okay, we're going to have to allocate capital to addressing these challenges. It's not right that we're having these impacts on people and planet, or that we're bearing these risks. Let's put some capital towards addressing those issues as our priority topics to challenge and to do something better with. And that's what a materiality assessment should do. It shouldn't just help you report. It should help you run your better business in a better way. So that's still in scope. I think what could happen is, so for those people who don't know, there's been people working at B Lab who've tried very hard to make B Corp 2.0 interoperable, to use that really clumsy word, with emerging European regulation like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And this requirement for double materiality, you see, is in both of them, right? It's and that's not by accident. Now, I think what can happen here is that for companies that have dropped out from the scope of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, I think there's a shift is happening, really. So they were designed, the B Corp standards were designed to be interoperable with this, but so a top slice of companies only are going to be captured. I think there's an opportunity for large B Corps, not north of 1,000, but 250 to 1,000 in there, who might be suppliers to those companies that are captured. If you've become a B Corp, you're likely to become a preferred supplier, because the way that the regulation works is it asks you as a big business, what's in your supply chain? If you're in your supply chain and we've already done a double materiality system, we know we're managing those risks for you, you can buy safely from us. I kind of think there's an opportunity for B Corp to fill a gap, if you like, in that range. So rather than being interoperable, I think there's a sort of like an opportunity to go and be that next tier down from those 1,000+ companies. For most B Corps, less than 1,000 people.
So just to clarify, and you may not know this, but for example, if Patagonia, based in the US, but they sell in Europe, right? So would that mean Patagonia as a US entity would need to do the new standards in order to sell in Europe? Is that kind of like how you're...
Well, so the timing of them being captured by the European regulation has been pushed back, and it's only like 450 million euros of revenue in the European Union. So from a regulatory perspective, you've got to have a big business in Europe to get captured by the regulations. But I guess my argument is, if you want to sell to those companies that are captured by the regulations, why not align yourself to the sort of requirements that they are facing? And one way you could do that is say, yeah, we don't have to do CSRD, the directive piece, but we're going to become a B Corp, and we've done a double materiality assessment, and we know what our salient human rights issues are, and we're taking care of those. So you can buy in confidence from us, because we're not going to be a problem for you when you look at your supply chain. I think that's an interesting potential.
And Mike, for your work on Purpose Economy, is Purpose Economy Canada, that's not a regulatory sort of initiative. It's more sort of, I guess it's probably more embodying, like sort of how do you live like a purpose-driven company? I wonder if you could speak to that and as well.
Yeah, so the Canadian Purpose Economy project is just that. It's a project. We haven't incorporated it as an entity. It's sort of housed within Canadian Business for Social Responsibility. So it's a program of CBSR. But what we're aiming to do is dramatically and rapidly increase the take-up of social purpose in business over the next few years. And we're addressing that through 11 sort of strategic leverage points, all of which are on the purposeeconomy.ca website. But for example, how do we encourage more CEOs to take up this thinking? Or how do we get, if we're certifying as a director of a business, how do we get more boards of directors trained to understand how to oversee the purpose of a corporation? And there's some very specific definitions that we're using. So we have effectively adopted the same definition of a social purpose business as is now enshrined in the new standards. It's that phrase I used before about making an optimal strategic contribution to the long-term well-being of people and the environment. Powerful definition that we could unpack. Optimal meaning optimized for the size and scale and capacity of the business. Strategic meaning toward a meaningful end and overseen by the highest governing authority in the organization. And then towards the long-term well-being of all people in the environment, i.e. sustainability. So if that's the definition that we're taking, it's no accident. We didn't come up with that definition. That's the definition effectively in the British Standards Institution's PAS 808 standard. And it's the candidate definition for a new international standards organization standard that should be published next year. That's just gone out for community consultation. ISO 37011 will be the international standard on social purpose organizations. So it's fantastic that B Lab has aligned to that. The Canadian Purpose Economy Project has aligned to that. Many others internationally have aligned to that expectation as well. So we want more companies to take up a social purpose defined that way as the reason they exist. It's their raison d'etre. It's not shareholder capitalism and sort of return to the shareholder. It's not stakeholder capitalism and merely managing down the negative impacts. It's about pursuit of positive contribution in the world. And I think that's as big we made the shift from sort of Milton Friedman and Chicago School and shareholder centricity to stakeholder centricity through the whole sustainability movement. That's a paradigm shift. That's a very different way of thinking about the role of business in society, the responsibility of business to society. I think it's potentially as equally as big a shift to go to, well, actually, a reason needs to exist to make a positive contribution. And does that mean that some businesses and business models and even sectors might need to retire and disappear? I think it does. I'm speaking for myself. I think there are whole sectors that need to disappear. Does that mean a lot of enterprises will need to go through fairly dramatic change? Yep, I think it does. And I think B-Lab has a role to play in showing a path to making those changes. And then we've taken it a level further with the Canadian Purpose Economy Project. And we've said, well, look, if that's the role of business in society, what does it look like for us to have a purpose economy? An economy powered by the pursuit of long-term well-being for all, in which business and regulatory and financial systems foster an equitable, flourishing, and resilient future. So it's not just about business. Society isn't just about business, although we have sort of an outsized influence on society, particularly in sort of Western capitalist societies, but it's also about regulatory systems. It's also about financial systems. So how can we shift the way those work to support this long-term pursuit of well-being for everybody? So that's what we're trying to advocate for and develop best practices for, drive change toward with the Canadian Purpose Economy Project. All the resources are open source. Everything is downloadable off the website. And there's 4 or 6 tools that the Canadian Purpose Economy Project has developed that are now embedded in the body of knowledge around the new standards.
Can we adopt that in the US? Can we just copy your homework?
Yeah. Absolutely.
We're going to US unpurpose economy. That's the direction we've been heading. Yeah. And Adam, I guess, to sort of circle back on the European component, was there anything that B Corps need to be aware of, or like, what do you see coming with that, and sort of should listeners be aware of in terms of like maybe it applies to their business?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So I think if you are a B Corp and you trade in Europe, you've got to get in touch with your local B Lab and make sure that you're not going to fall foul of this Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition Directive, which means you might have to recertify again next year, like I say. That's super important, I think. I do think that there's a sort of market opportunity, I guess is the point I want to make here. That I do think that if you're a big business operating in Europe and you've been dropped out of the scope of Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which like 40,000 businesses have been dropped out of that now, you could argue that becoming a B Corp offers a clear alternative to signal kind of best in class impact leadership, right? And it will position you as a great, an opportunity to be a supplier to those really big businesses that are captured by the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I think you can fill a gap. I think you can become a preferred supplier of those very large businesses who are captured by that European regulation. So I think there's a compliance need with the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition, super important not to get that wrong. And then there's an opportunity with the rollback and the tightening of the scope of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that B Corps really need to be aware of.
What if we turn to the classic debate within the B Corp community is the big tent or the small tent, or what are we, multinationals? And I'm curious, Adam, what's your projection, if you were so bold to lean into your courage as a leader here, right? What's your projection for some of these large B Corps, where one of my clients is a winery that's small winery, and they were like, well, how many of these new standards apply to us? And we looked, and it's about 40, there's like 40 questions that apply to them. Yeah. Of the 7, there's 40 sub requirements. And then we looked at, okay, well, what if you were a large or extra large? And it's like over 100, so there's definitely a huge increase in difficulty and like stringency around large and extra large companies. And what is your Yeah, what's your take? Do you feel like the new standards are going to scare away some of the very, very double XL B Corps? Do you feel like they're going to just say we're going to make it? What do you think is going to happen with multinationals as it relates to these new standards?
Well, okay, fortune telling. I think that it is going to scare some companies away. Yes,
some existing B Corps are going to leave. You think?
So, yes, no question. I think it's inevitable, and I think it actually might be a good thing. So, to some of the points we've already been discussing, if you got the badge because it was good for your marketing, and that's all it really meant to you, and now you've got to come up with a public purpose, or you got to reflect on the lobbying groups you're part of, or you got to revisit your tax policy. I don't know. Like, that sounds tough to me, and I'm pleased it sounds tough, right? Like, I think listeners probably are well aware that there are these 7 impact topics. There are 2 that are kind of governance-y that I think are really hard for large companies. There's purpose and stakeholder governance, and there's government affairs and collective action. I think those 2 governance ones, parking the E's and the S's, which I think actually probably kind of relatively straightforward for larger companies to tackle. But these governance ones are, I think, by design, harder for larger businesses. And I'm pleased about that. So can you come up with a public purpose for why you exist? Can your highest governing body sign off on that? Can you roll that into your strategy? Can you report on progress every year in delivering that? Really? I don't think every multinational is going to find that an easy thing to do at all. And they might even, to where you were sort of going, I think, Ryan, they might go, that's just a massive distraction that we don't need right now. We've got plenty of brickbats in the way of just thriving. We just so can't think about a public purpose thing and strategy around it. Yeah. Like, I think that might do it on its own. But I also think that the government affairs piece is going to be tricky, as I was saying earlier, around lobbying groups that you're members of around tax. Multinationals play the tax game by definition. That's kind of what they do. They've got a Dutch subsidiary, or they've got whatever it is, right? That's part of the sort of way of operating, a standard practice. And I kind of think actually, I hope B-Lab is here already. It requires additional conversations, probably both before and after certifying. So I think before certifying, I think B-Lab should be going to these multinationals going, do you get it? Do you get what we're trying to do here? Can we run this by you? Because this is not going to be easy for you. And that's by design, by the way. But we think it could be really valuable for you. Like, make the value proposition case for large businesses to stay in the community, but do it in a, dare I say, courageous way and go, this is tough. It's deliberately tough. And if you want to get on board, we think there's some real benefits to you, but we get it if you don't, because here's what you need to know that's coming down the track. I don't think that should be left to some middle manager to kind of go, I think we should stay. Do you think we should stay? I think that should be a very senior level conversation. And if they do stay, furthermore, I think it's actually what happens after the fact that really matters. I've a little WhatsApp group that I co-convene in the UK. We floated this to B-Lab UK's executive director, Chris Turner, before. I think multinationals, B Corp, should have a kind of post-certification induction into the movement. I don't mean one that's limited to this exhausted, lead beekeeper who's done their best and is collapsing in a heap in the corner, having got this massive behemoth across the line. I mean, like, the board of directors or senior leadership need to have like a year's worth of exposure to, some history, some inspiration, some motivation, and frankly, an invitation to step up and, dare I say it, seize the moment and be the change. Like that. That's what it means to be a B Corp if you're going to be a multinational. These are the things we expect of you, and you have an outsized opportunity, right? We're all signed off on this idea that most of us are signed off on the idea that we need multinationals in the movement to gain credibility, critical mass. But, well, okay, if they're so, good for mass, let's see them throw their weight around in a positive way. But let's help them do that as the movement. Let's lean in and support them. But B-Lab has to curate that. B-Lab has to make that happen. And B-Lab, I think, has to make that an additional requirement for XX large companies to go through this kind of welcome to the movement induction post-certification.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think I agree with everything that you've said. And I would say, I think we know we're going to churn some bees as a result of the new standards. In fact, I think at the Champions Retreat in Vancouver, Jorge Fontana's outgoing CEO said as much. Expects churn to go from, I think the numbers he cited were 6% up to double or triple that. So don't quote me on that, but that's my recollection of what he said on stage. But he certainly talked about more churn. It's a harder achievement. You're going to see more people back off from it. With specific reference to multinationals, I'm fascinated with among many, the instinct that large equals evil. And I don't think it's true. I think it can be true. I think actually large equals complexity. And it's the complexity of those large international systems that is the thing that we need to address. There are so many good people inside those big organizations trying to do good things in a challenging or a broken system. So how do we support those people? And I think that Adam's solution there is a really, really good one. How do we support those people? By educating their board and educating senior leadership about the responsibilities of this work and their responsibilities at the sheer scale that they're at. But I also think sort of alongside that, the groundswell of support for purpose in business is growing incredibly quickly. There's a brand pie study, both in 2023 and 2024, that said the majority of senior leaders, CEOs and leadership teams, 76% believe purpose has grown in importance over the last 5 years. 75% think it's going to continue to grow in importance in the next 5 years. So this is a trend, right? The CEOs see this as an important trend to consider. 70% of them recognize that purpose is a strategic driver of business benefits, right? So they're unlocking organizational success through the lens of social purpose. 75% said the integration of purpose creates value in the short term as well as over the long run, right? So this is like immediate returns on this investment in social purpose, which of course is embedded in the new standards. So I think there's a groundswell of momentum for social purpose. I think that it's embedded in the new standards and this idea of encouraging leaders to be thinking about this. And the fact of the matter is most large companies are already starting to articulate social purpose. So we just did a study, the Canadian Purpose Economy Project did a study of the TSX 60. So this is the 60 biggest companies in Canada, biggest publicly traded companies in Canada, similar to the S&P 500. 40% of them have articulated a social purpose. Now, there's more work to do to go in and see how many of them have actually embedded or begun to implement it or mobilized all of their capitals to pursue it. There'll be a smaller number, but 40% of them have publicly disclosed a purpose statement. 40% of the 60 biggest companies in Canada. This is the what's the phrase? The horse is out of the stable. This is running. So we can support it, we can nurture it, but this is a movement that's got significant momentum already.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask, maybe Mike and then Adam, is, what should listeners be looking out for or like listening for, or like what do you have your antenna up for to like look for, like with the new standards coming, the sort of with the way the movement is evolving? Is there any advice you'd give to folks, just to things they should track or keep on mind?
One of the things I've been thinking about, and you've asked the question in previous pods, is what's the movement doing well and what's it not doing well? And in thinking about that ahead of today, I'd say, like, I think we should be celebrating this 10,000th certified company milestone. That's a hell of a number. That's pretty remarkable. We should celebrate that. We should be popping champagne. But I also think we shouldn't pretend we're even scratching the surface. I think both of those things can be true, right? There are 1.2 million businesses in Canada alone. In Canada alone, 10,000 certified companies globally, that's 1.2 million businesses. Come on, we're not even scratching the surface. We've got a long, long way to go to change the way the world does business. I reflect on my experience of the B Corp community when I sort of started to get involved, probably 2010-ish, 11, 12, maybe. From then through till probably up till the pandemic, I was consistently surprised at the tone and tenor of our conversations in the community. Boy, we were self-congratulatory. Like, it was really, really hard to get a critical word in edgeways, right? And kudos to you, Ryan, for putting those critical words in and showing others how they could speak up and sort of change the tone and tenor. Yes, we should celebrate milestones. Yes, we should celebrate successes, but let's not pretend that we're anywhere near complete on this work. We're barely scratching the surface of the surface. There's a long, long way to go. So I think we need the determination, we need the camaraderie and support in the network. I think those are the things that I'd like to see. So I'm looking for the leaders that are, they're not self-flagellating, they're not self-critical, but they are confronting the brutal facts of us having a long way to go, to use Jim Collins' phrase, right? That have the humility to understand we all need to learn, that have the empathy to recognize that there are really good people inside these big organizations that are trying to drive change, and the compassion to want to help them, and the generosity to meet them where they're at. These are the kind of traits and characteristics that I'm looking for in people and in teams that are real advocates for this work.
Same question for you, Adam. What are you looking out for? What would you advise folks to sort of keep on their minds? What comes up for you?
As they work with the new standards, I would say, is that what you mean?
Yeah,
or
just I guess more. It could be B Corp movement, and then that would include the new standards.
I think one thing that I've noticed, and I think we need to do a better job of in our, like as consultants when we're supporting companies, is they need to be able to track the difference it's made. And they need to be confident about attributing it appropriately to B Corp, where if that's the case, and they need to talk about it. And I have quite a few clients now going, we're not really sure about this B Corp thing. We're not sure if it's been of much value to us. And I go, so when do you talk about it? Oh, we don't really talk about it. Do your people know? Yeah, some of them. I think the guys in operations know a bit about it. Right. And what about your leadership team? Do they celebrate it? Well, they like it when we get a new point score, I guess. Like it's not enough, right? Like if we absolutely with you, Mike, like we've got to celebrate our successes, but we've got to encourage those companies who are kind of going on a journey to be a little bit. I'm not suggesting it's all perfect. That's the last thing I want people to do. I don't want them to say we've made it, but I do want them internally to have a little bit more information sharing about the transition that they're on, and that this is hard work, and we're using this framework. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and it's actually making us think some other things we haven't got to yet that aren't in the framework. We might do those as well, and like a little bit more of that sort of self-reflection and communication about the process internally. I think people are fearful about stating their values and their ambitions for the change they want to see in their business. And then if you get them one-on-one, they're like, we should this, we should that. They've got loads of ideas, loads of enthusiasm. But as a collective, there's this kind of like, I'm not going to say anything. This is the senior leadership here. Like, I'll just button it. It's like, we can't have that. And we've got to support companies in this movement to have a lot more confidence about sharing the information internally, discussing how difficult it is to make this transition, describing why it's important, having it owned by leaders, having the challenge sort of socialized in the business and shared, and encourage inputs. Like all of that has to happen way more, because that's about being an exemplar of being a business as a force for good. It's absolutely about the learning, about the space you create for others, about the opportunities that are thrown up. None of that happens if you two people in a side room somewhere beavering away on a questionnaire. And it's got to move from the side room to the boardroom. Like that's got to be what B Corp 2.0 does. It was sort of a promise of B Corp in general, and I don't think it's ever really been realized. That's got to be what 2.0 does, and we've all got to help make that happen.
I'm really curious for your reflections on that same question, Ryan. What are you seeing, and what would you like to see?
I think one thing, and I've talked to the folks at B Lab and Clay specifically around this, but it's like I feel like the B Corp movement needs some strong leadership. We've kind of been a little bit rudderless for the last few years. It's been, I don't want to put it on anyone's shoulders, but I think B Lab, we kind of need to feel B Lab being like organized and excited and like confident in their own position, which I feel like it's been that the three founders have stepped down and moved on, and it's went from that entrepreneurial scrappy mindset to the sort of more professional management of the organization, which is always a challenge. But I think B Lab is sort of coming out of the slump, right? Like the new standards launched, and I do feel like they're being hyper focused on the standards and not getting caught up into some of my like, come on, talk about multinationals. And I've like invited them to talk about some of these more controversial topics, but they're smart. They're like, no, we need to focus on standards rollout. We need to be hyper focused. But I do think I'd love to support and encourage B Lab to really like keep the vision and leadership alive, because I feel like that helps the companies then sort of like find ourselves and move forward. Like when it feels like there's a lot of confusion or disorganization, it's a damper on the movement. So that's one thing. And then I do think the 2026 is kind of like a little bit of a make or break year, right? For the new standards. I mean, it's not really going to break. It would just be a make or delay year. Like it'll either like all happen in 2026, or it will just be like, well, we're going to give everyone a 6-month extension because that was way too much to do in 1 year. So that might happen. Who knows how the European Union and will feel about those B Corps that have not certified on the new standards. So yeah, I feel a lot of ways, but I do feel like some of these conversations, and I appreciate the two of you coming on, because we're sort of like sense making together. We're like, do you see this? And do you see that? And maybe to sort of move into the last couple of questions here, I'd love to hear from both of you, maybe Adam to start. What do you need, and how can the listeners help support your work?
No, thank you for the invitation. Well, we talk about the 4 stages of impact at Junction. So based on some nice work from our friends at the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, we've built out a model, kind of like, short-term thinking right through to kind of purpose-driven organization. And we've sort of got some questions that we've designed to kind of help sort of self-assess. So we'd love companies to take that diagnostic and kind of beat it up and see where they land, see what the next steps of being truly purposeful and impactful are. I mean, as Mike suggested, we're happy to meet people where they are, but we're also courageous and we want to move them on to the next level. So we built the tool with that in mind. So I'd love people to take the test, see where they are on the 4 stages of impact.
Great. We'll have to get the link for that for the show notes.
Yeah, we'll get you that.
Yeah. And Mike, what about you? What do you need right now?
Well, it's a really interesting time to be in an international business. We're thriving in the UK and Europe, lots and lots of work. Not so here in Canada, right? I think I'm gonna, the orangutan in the room, Mr. Trump and his administration have thrown a wet blanket on economics. I think there's a lot of leaders that are nervous, scared even. There's an incredible slowdown in decision making. There's an incredible drop in ambition around the kinds of projects and efforts that people are going to make. And so that's hit us in the pocketbook. We need more work. We need to generate some more contracts and work with some new clients. So the offer that I think I'd put out there, the invitation I'd put out is, yeah, it's a hard time to be courageous. It's a hard time to take the bold leap, but let's have a conversation. Let's just talk about it. And we can share what we're seeing in other enterprises that maybe are sort of putting their heads up a little bit and finding opportunities in this tough time. There's still a very, very big economy that's moving along quite well. So we just need to participate in that. So I'm interested, anybody that's interested, to just have a conversation about what could happen and what changes they might be able to make to find opportunities right now. Totally open for the conversations.
And I think I hope people realize that this is a cyclical thing, and that the folks who are actually still doing the work now will be so much farther ahead when it swings back, And so, yeah, I would just advocate for folks, reach out to Mike and Adam. What about like website and, if you want to mention your B Corp 2.0 series or any other resources that folks should be aware of?
So sure, happy to. So we're at junction.com, junxion.com. And I thank you for the shout out. I am hosting a series of talks at the moment called the Be Ready series in the UK. And that's really an opportunity just to sort of springboard from each of the 7 impact topics and get into a wider conversation and discussion about what's underneath the hood of that topic. So you can find out more about those if you're in the UK. And we're partnering with our co-working space X and Y on those, which has been great. And we've got some fantastic speakers we've got some more coming up in the autumn and towards Christmas. So as Mike suggested, we're always up for a chat and love doing the card on all things purpose, impact, and system change.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you both on, and we'll have to probably do it again in 2026 once we have a better sense of what's happening with the rollout, because I imagine you all can give us your your pulse check on the anxiety level or not of of the companies you're working with who are affected by these regulations. But yeah, thanks for both coming on. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having us. Appreciate the invitation. It's been a delicious conversation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, me too, Ryan. Great to be here with you.
Hey, Beyond the Bee listeners. If you're looking for even more inspiring conversations with leaders on the front lines of our movement towards just futures, be sure to subscribe to Next Economy Now, produced by the team at Lift Economy. Next Economy Now broadens the focus beyond the B Corp movement to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, equitable, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Check out our latest episodes at lifteconomy.com/podcast. You can subscribe to Next Economy Now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.